Hi, this is Miss Litton, and this is my wonderful, exciting, so excited to learn period 1 class. Say hey. Hi. Oh, that was lame. All right, so chapter 15 is about Darwin and evolution. And let me get your brain in the right spot. We have fully discussed the central dogma, DNA replication. Then give me the next one. Transcription, which is DNA to what? RNA. And then translation is RNA to proteins. Okay, evolution just means change over time. Those changes can be due to chance happenings. And we'll put that in a big old group called genetic drift. Okay? Or it could be a factor of natural selection. What do you hear in natural? Nature selecting, right? So you could have spontaneous changes in the DNA, or you could be selecting for certain DNA. Now, what DNA in the phenotype is going to be successful? Whoever can survive in that particular what? Environment. Those organisms that can survive in that particular environment are going to live and have more what? More sex, right? And reproduce, okay? And more of the same will be generated. Do you agree with that? So all we're doing is we're taking that central dogma that we had and looking to see how that DNA changes over time. Now, this is just an introductory chapter on this. We're going to look a little bit at the history of it. But when I was putting together and updating the presentation, I found this frog, and I just thought you would like to meet him, okay? He's very happy, and he wants you to learn. Okay. So when you look at a whale, okay, I just threw him in there because I saw him. I'm like, I cannot throw him away. He has to be in the presentation. When you look at a whale, whales have hip bones. What does that tell you about whales? Okay, yes. What did you say? Did you say something? You said hips don't lie. You are laughing, but that's true. Do you hear it? That is true. Okay? If they have hip bones and part of a femur, then that means they used to be on what? Land. That is absolutely true. Okay? Now, they have remnants of a hip bone. Do you know what that kind of structure is called? It starts with a V. Vestigial structure. A vestigial structure. Just like you have a what kind of bone back here? Tail. You don't have a tail, but you could have had an ancestor that had a what? Tail. This is a piece of evidence for evolution. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and look at historically what was thought, and then we're going to end up with what's the evidence of evolution. And then we'll start, we have another chapter on it as well. So we're going to start with Charles Darwin. Here he is at 31 years of age. Okay? He went, you guys, some of you are getting tired and loose. Focus in. He went on a little journey. Where did he go to? Galapagos. Yeah, he went. We always think about the Galapagos Islands, but his trip was even bigger than that. It was a 5-year voyage, and he was the naturalist. Now, I want to give you a little bit of history about Darwin, and I gave it to you in your notes. So look at your notes under Darwin's trip. You see when it started. Look at number 2. He was unpaid. He just got to go on the trip. But look at number 3. He was going to what? Med school. Okay, but he couldn't hack it. Okay, so as a result, he couldn't stomach. He went to be a clergyman. So what is a clergyman? Something to do with what? Church. The church. Now, do you think there has ever been a problem with evolution and the church? Okay, so historically speaking, there have been a lot of issues with that. And as we go into this discussion about evolution, okay, I want to just bring something up because some of you are like, oh my gosh, she is Satan spewing Satan's orders, okay? She is talking about evolution and evolution is wrong, okay? I want you to hear me on this. We're not having a debate about evolution. You might have views, your own personal views about evolution, but those of you who have some sort of faith, what is faith? Can faith be proven? No, it's why it's called faith, right? Okay? In the science realm, I can only, whatever I can apply the scientific method to, and I can show evidence for something, claim, evidence, reason, That's what I use and teach here. So what we're assuming is anything that's supernatural. If you have some sort of faith, I'm not telling you to lose your faith. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is I'm only discussing what I can apply the scientific method to. So if there was no supernatural event, how could all of this have come about? Okay? And if you're someone who really has strong feelings about it, you want to be knowledgeable about evolution. So if you wanted to argue against some aspect of it, you could with evidence. Like my mom, I come from a very faith-based family. My mom would send me literature all the time, anti-evolution literature. I'm like, okay, thank you, Mom. Thank you, Mom. I would go on church retreats, and they'd be like, oh, what do you do? I'd be like, oh, I'm a science teacher. Oh, what do you teach? Oh, I teach biology. And then they would go, do you teach evolution? And I'd be like, I do. And I'd be, and I'm okay with it. And they're like, don't sit next to her. Okay? You have to, if at some point you want to talk about how I resolve what you would see as conflicts, I don't have conflicts with it. And if you ever want to talk to me personally about it, you can, okay? But I don't have a problem with what I'm going to teach you right here, okay? And you want to have a good understanding so you can argue with wisdom and not like some of the things I've heard in a church van, okay? I just want to go, oh my gosh, you're so stupid. Okay, so he went on this trip. And he did have a background, obviously, in medicine. He had a background in religion. And his viewpoint began changing throughout the voyage. And several other scientists influenced him during and after his journey. So let's look a little bit more into his journey. The big idea here is descent with modification. What does that mean? Descent, what is that referring to? Okay, so the species that are coming next and next and next, right? With modifications, meaning those species are changing over what time? If you go into a cave and you see a salamander and it has withered eyes, would you think God created that salamander with withered eyes? Or is it possible that salamander, if you looked in its evolutionary past, it lived somewhere where it needed its eyes and then started to move closer and closer and deeper into the cave. And over time, eyes became less and less important, so they began to wither. That is descent with modification. Okay? That would be change over time. Okay? So if we look at some of the parts of his journey, okay, he looked at a rhea, which looked just like an African ostrich. So he said, okay, there's similarities, and they're on two different continents. And so he looked at that. Okay, so that was here, B, right here. Okay, and then he looked at the Patagonian desert, and he looked at how sparse it was, and he looked at the organisms that were in the desert as compared to other regions. Now, are you going to have different adaptations in the desert? Yeah, and so he's going, okay, is it that they were just created in this one spot? Or could they have evolved to live in that area? He looked at, go away, descent with modification. He looked at the Andes Mountains, and he looked at the fossils that were in those mountains. Now, some of the fossils that he looked at on mountainsides, he found seashells up in the mountains. What does that tell you about that area? It was under the water. Okay, so that's referred to as geologic evolution. Okay, difference in changes in the geology over time. And some of those fossils that he found, he did not see ones that were exactly like it today, but they were similar to it, so he's assuming that they were descendants of it. Okay, here, okay, he saw rainforests, and he compared these with the types of organisms that were growing in deserts, and this leads to a whole field called biogeography. And you're looking at, you know what's the supercontinent called? Pangea. So that's when all the continents were together, right? And then they started breaking apart, right? So you had Laurasia and Gondwanaland, two big supercontinents. And places like Antarctica used to be in areas where it was warmer. And so that would explain why, if you look there, you could find amphibian fossils. Because was it always there? No, but at one point the continent was in a different location, so that would explain why you have those types of fossils there. When you start to look at some species of fern, you see it's universal. If the continents are all together, you could see how that fern lived there. As the continents spread out, different organisms evolved. There was a huge mammalian expansion about 66 million years ago. At that point, all the continents were separated. So that's why you might explain the great diversity in mammals. For instance, what could you find in Australia that you would not find here? Kangaroo. Okay. Now, kangaroos, what do they eat? Do they eat rats? No, they're herbivores. Okay. Kangaroo. Okay, so the kangaroos are giant herbivores. They play a role in that ecosystem there. Who are some herbivores that you might find in Africa? Giraffes. That's the role, okay, or elephants. That's the role they play here. What are some herbivores that were here in North America? What did you say? How about buffalo? Tatanka. All right. Now, you have different types of mammals filling that spot in that niche, okay, in different areas, and you have this huge diversity because all the continents were separated then, so they developed and evolved differently in those areas. When all the continents were together, you see more of that similarity. So environment can play a role. Then you have the Galapagos Islands and those marine iguanas. Those are endemic. You only find them there, only in that one spot. So he's thinking to himself, did God just create it in that one spot? Or could it be an iguana that evolved to live in that area? Okay. And then you look at the finches. So let's say there are 13 species of finch. Did all 13 get made there by God? Or could there have been one or two ancestral finch and they did what's called adaptive radiation? One said, I'm going to eat the big seeds. The other ones were eating the little seeds. Now, they didn't have a little meeting and decide that. Those who had the bigger beaks could eat the bigger seeds. Those who had the smaller beaks ate the smaller seeds. Okay? And so then you end up having a whole group that eat just big seeds and others eat small seeds. And then you have another group that eats what? Medium seeds, then one who finds a twig and digs out insects. So they're all kind of living in those different, spreading out to fill all those niches. So all of these things are what's going around in his head. Okay? And then just to give you a timeline, okay, 1735. What happened in 1735? Linnaeus. Have you heard of Linnaeus? Linnaeus, and we're going to talk about him in just a minute, he came up with a naming system in Latin called binomial nomenclature. Okay, to try to name species, to simplify the names. Okay, what happened in 1776?
America.
Yeah, United States independence, the country you live in now. Okay, that was in 1776. So that came after Linnaeus. I'm just trying to show you to get perspective. 1835, this is when Darwin took his trip. Okay, 1835, just to give you perspective. Okay, 1859. That's when Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. How much time passed there?
14.
14 years? Try a little more.
Jake?
Over 20 years, right? Why do you think he waited? The Origin of Species. Do you remember what else he studied?
Bible.
He studied the Bible. The Origin of Species. What do you think most people thought the origin of species came from? God. Now here we're developing now different species, and you can try to explain how that is. That was a huge controversy. He was not even going to publish until he read somebody else's paper who came up with the same idea as he did. And he's like, oh man, I've known that for over 20 years. I better publish. And they ended up publishing jointly, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, 1863, Lincoln. Okay, that came after Darwin. 1865, Mendel. Okay, Darwin would have loved that. If he had known about Mendel's experiments, then he could explain the variation amongst individuals. And that would have really helped with his idea about natural selection. 1944, Avery, McLeod, and McCarty. You know who that is, right? What were they doing? The DNA, yeah. Okay, is the substance of inheritance. Good. Who did they, what, okay, yeah. 1945, World War II ended. 1953, that's when Watson and Crick published. Okay, and then 2016. Yes.
It seems like every sort of like generation has like a one big scientific person and like discovery. Has there been one of those like in our?
Well, you can kind of break it up into different areas, whether it's genetics or medicine or evolution. I mean, you could break it up, but those discoveries are happening all the time, I would say. But there are definitely some big time.
Did people at the time like know who this person was?
No, remember Mendel? He died. Nobody even knew anything about him. Yeah, and what he had contributed.
Right now might like be.
Yes, but what's different now?
Internet,
exactly. When things are discovered, there's a way to get that information out to everybody. Like right now, if we made some huge discovery, send, that's it. Everybody has it. They didn't have that before. Also, think about the collaborations you have. So you can see what's going on here and this research site and this research site and this. You're collaborating on some notes right now. There's just 3 or 4 of you. Think about the collaboration that goes on in science now and the perspective that you have. Okay, so now let's look at some of the scientists that played a role. So Linnaeus, I went and got a picture, and then I also went and found a picture of his actual book, his written work. You want to know him for being the father of what would be binomial nomenclature. Bi means what? Two. Nomial is referring to a name, binomial nomenclature. Now, he focused on plants. That's what he was identifying. He still believed in special creation, fixity of species, like that God created each and every individual. And it was an order of events with man being on top, okay? Like we were the apex of the whole earth, of all living systems. Later, he started to think maybe there is change over time. Okay, Leclerc. Now this is the one I made smaller. Do you see the font is smaller? Okay, I'm giving it to you for historical perspective, but I don't think they will ever ask you a question on this on the AP exam. But he wrote a 44-volume history of all plants and animals at the time, and he thought there was, when he studied all of this, what did he see? Descent with modification. So I don't want you to think like, oh, Darwin came up with it. People were thinking about it. The big problem was there was no mechanism to explain that. That's what Darwin came up with. Lamarck came up with a mechanism. We're going to talk about him, but it was just wrong. Okay, that's not an argument. I mean, it's just he was, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so he looked at things like how does the environment affect the animals? Because he's analyzing all the plants and animals out there. How does the environment affect it? What does migration do? Geographical isolation, if you're stuck there on the Galapagos Islands. The struggle for existence. He wouldn't commit to the idea of evolution, but he certainly was hinting around it. Okay, and the way I always remember that is Leclerc. He would have to be a good clerk to keep track of all the plants and animals. Okay, Erasmus Darwin. Here's a name we know. This was Charles Darwin's grandfather. Okay, and so obviously he's going to have some import in his life and his views. He was a physician. He was a naturalist. He also suggested the possibility of common descent, but he had no mechanism. He couldn't explain how organisms could change over time. He looked at animal development as embryos, and that's one thing that's done even today is comparative embryology and comparative development, and even more so now because of the technology is comparing the genes that control development. He looked at artificial selection. Do any of you have an expensive dog? Nobody has an expensive. Can dogs be very expensive?
Yeah.
How expensive if you want to get let's say a lab? It could be $1,000, right? It could be $1,000 for you to go get a lab easily, okay? And that's because they're selecting for a purebred of that particular lab. That is artificial selection. Artificial because it's not nature that's selecting what's best adapted, it's man. I think if you get, what are those spotted dogs that are on Dalmatians? Spotted dogs, they're on fire trucks. They have a problem because they've been selected and selected and selected for due to inbreeding of hip dysplasia. So they can have really, really difficult times with their hips all through artificial selection. The wheat that we grow, that's artificial selection for large kernels. Strawberries, artificial selection. Okay? So if you could do artificial selection and get bigger and bigger and bigger strawberries or more of this one type of dog, why couldn't nature do the same thing? Which all a species is, if you say you have a species, where do you draw the line and say this is a whole new species, whole new individual? There have been so many changes that accrued. Now it's a new species. Yeah.
Could artificial development be caused by humans, like in industrial?
Oh, it is. Artificial selection is humans.
It's just like if they like, because I read about how like there was this thing with moths, where like the trees would get all stained with like coal and stuff, and they'd have to adapt to it.
Yes, we're going to talk about that. That's a huge, that's a big one. Yeah.
I read about like French bulldogs are like right now, so like, they can't even survive. Like they're dying at age like 7 or 8 because they can't like breathe. Like the dogs have like really short.
Oh,
noses.
Interesting.
And they're like it's like a danger. Like dogs that are born that way are like so unhealthy that people are like opposed to purebred dogs like that because it's like inbred basically.
Yeah, it is. They are inbred because you just keep you're making your gene pool smaller and smaller, or shallower and shallower, right, as you go through. He also looked at vestigial organs because he was a doctor and he looked at anatomy, he studied them, and he goes, why does this organism have this? And vestigial structures point to our ancestral past. For instance, can anybody move their ears? Okay, there you go. So watch me move my ears. Yeah, I can't, okay? But some people can move their ears. What does that point to? It points to our ancestral past where you have muscles that could actually move your ears, right? So he was looking at those items. Now we go to Cuvier. Now Cuvier, was the first to use comparative anatomy to classify animals. He founded paleontology, where you studied fossils. Now, he was still fixity of species, special creation. He believed in catastrophism, which meant that it looks like the fossil record, because that's what he studied, were fossils. It looks like it's changing over time. It's not. There were just major catastrophes, and it wiped organisms off the planet, and some other ones moved in their place. That's how he explained it. Now, the way I remember Cuvier is that the fossils are cuveyed with dirt, right? Covered up with dirt, the fossils, underground. Okay, come on, that's awesome. All right, so let me help you and get you caught up on your notes. So Linnaeus, the word you're looking for there is binomial nomenclature. Cuvier is comparative anatomy for classification. Founded what? What are you putting in there? Paleontology. Still fixity of species, and he believed in catastrophism. Okay, and then this brings us now to Lamarck. Now, he was the first to say, here's evolution, and here's the mechanism for it. Okay? He was the first for that. Now, he had he could explain how organisms, he was way off, but he explained how organisms adapt. He talked about use and disuse, which means if you use something a lot, you will have more of it, and if you disuse it, if you don't use it, you would have less of it. Okay? But he said that there was inheritance of these things you used more of, inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay? And what he would say is during the lifetime, a giraffe, the reason why you look in the fossil record and giraffes' necks are longer is because during the lifetime of the giraffe, they would stretch their necks longer and longer, use and disuse, right? Use of his neck. So stretch, stretch, stretch. So when they had kids, offspring, their necks were born a little bit longer. And then they would use their necks their whole lifetime. So when they had offspring, their necks were born with a little bit longer. Now you and I understand about chromosomes, because that would say like if we worked out a lot and we were like, then our babies would be born
Really?
Right? That's what we know that's not going to affect our gametes, right? That's not going to affect our eggs and sperm. So that's why he was wrong. What would Darwin say? Darwin say you have a bunch of giraffes and not all of them are going to survive. And there are variations among all those giraffes. And those giraffes who had the longest necks are eating the most food because they can get the leaves, and they're having the most sex and reproducing. So those are the ones that are reproducing and making babies. And of their babies, some of those necks might be longer, some might be shorter, and some might be just the same in their offspring. But of all their offspring, the ones with the longest necks are the ones that are what? Surviving and reproducing. So if you have vast amounts of time, then evolution can happen. And time was big because most people thought that the earth was very, very young. They would take the generations that are in the Torah or the Bible and go, okay, if this many generations live, then this is how old the earth is. Okay? But now there were some other people. Lyell wrote a book about the earth being old. And so it was called Principles of Geology. And it proposed that the earth was millions of years old. And Darwin's reading this. So he's on this trip, seeing all these different types of ecosystems, seeing all these different species, and he's reading the earth is old. If the earth is old, it would allow for these differences to accrue, which could accrue so many differences that you are now a new species. Hence, the origin of species. Okay?
I'm just curious, like, what was his main idea for why he thought the earth was old?
Well, he thought it was old because he would study the changes that were occurring. Now, he believed in something that was Darwin didn't buy into it. Uniformitarianism, like you would have this many changes over time, and you could look at the layers in the rock and see changes over time. That's what contributed to it. Darwin didn't buy into Lyell's theory of uniformitarianism, but he did buy into the idea, the earth is old. And you're looking at those sedimentary rock layers. Okay? Now, Thomas Malthus, have you studied this in any of your classes?
Yeah. We take a test on it today.
Oh, a test today. Great. Okay, the struggle to live. Survival, well, you've heard of the phrase survival of the fittest, right? Okay, so you're not going to use that though, okay? But humans outgrow their food supply, death, famine. So he's reading about this, okay? So when you put all of this together, this is what helped him to formulate his idea of natural selection, okay? Oh, and then that brings, where are we at? Well, we probably are going to have to pick these. Let's do a couple. Let's try. See if you can answer. Okay, those of you in charge of the notes, let me give you a few words. Lamarck, what's the first word you're putting there? First, good. First to offer a hypothesis of how evolution via adaptation occurred. B, the word you're looking for is acquired. In Hutton's theory, published in Lyell's book, Principles of Geology, discussed the idea that the earth is old. And I gave you Thomas Malthus. You're going to get 100 on this. Oh! How did you remember this one? Leclerc, to write those 44 volumes. Yes, baby.
Are we gonna know dates for the tests, or just like who they were, what they did, or like
Who they did? I'm just throwing that on there. No. We've got two other big ideas. They're never going to ask you a date on an AP exam. Okay, California Thrasher. Oh my gosh. This is one you have to know. You got to know Linnaeus binomial nomenclature. You do have your notes right in front of you. Let me see who we need to mock. 5 seconds to fail, Snowy Egret. 5 seconds to failure. Not 5 seconds of summer, 5 seconds of failure.
It was the wrong letter.
Wait, is this?
That is a bill of shame.
I did read it. I read it.
1 week from today, you'll be getting ready to eat turkey.
I'm already ready. Is there a test on Friday? Like the Friday when you come back? Because it
The
says
Monday.
that on my calendar.
A quiz.
No. Like test, it said it was Friday.
I look at the calendar.
No, because like I did, and I was like, oh my god.
Oh, yeah, there is. Oh, you mean the Friday after. When you said the Friday we come back, I was saying we come back on Monday.
No.
Yeah, there is. It's just multiple choice.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
It turned out.
It's just multiple choice.
Oh, who was the first? Lamar.
I like learning about What? Who did you say it was? Erasmus? Erasmus? That's not even him. It's not here. Where? Him? Oh, no.
Yeah, Erasmus. Okay, who's this? A, Cuvier. Good. Who's this?
Darwin.
Which one? Charles. Okay, good. That's where we'll start next time. Okay, have good breaks. If you're coming to review, when is the review? Tomorrow.
Miss Lynn, this is period 1.
What?
This is period 1.
Oh.
That wouldn't have been amazing.
Hope you're having a good day.
Oh yeah, 'cause she was like.